Well, welcome everyone. On behalf of the Council of the Great Lakes Region, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar. I am Laura Shrake, Senior Program Director of Business and Sustainability at the Council. And this webinar and presentation topic have been months in the making because today we are launching a regional gap analysis for water stewardship and best practice in the Great Lakes region. The gap analysis has been carried out as part of our Great Lakes Water Innovation and Stewardship Exchange, also referred to as Great Lakes WISE, and was authored by today's speakers from Fresh Coast Climate Solutions. The gap analysis provides insight on where the region is positioned with respect to best practices, including corporate stewardship, regional water use, water quality, vulnerabilities, data availability, and so forth. It is an information-packed report, and today we are going to do our best to try unpacking some of it, at least as much as we can with the time that we have. Shortly, we will have Ray Mindock and Matthew Paper walk us through some of the highlights of this regional gap analysis. But first, as many of you may likely already know, the Great Lakes region is North America's economic engine. It is home to over 110 million people, and it is guardian to the largest surface freshwater system in the world. The Great Lakes Basin, comprised of the 5 Great Lakes and thousands of miles of surface water tributaries and groundwater aquifers, is a drinking water source for over 40 million people in the US and Canada. It also supports a variety of ecosystems and more than 3,500 plant and animal species. And because of the region's many attributes, including its abundant freshwater, the Great Lakes region is an attractive location for both businesses and individuals, and more are moving into the region. With population growth often comes economic growth, but so too comes new pressures on our natural resources, such as our water systems. And while the waters of the Great Lakes themselves may appear resilient and plentiful, we know that they are finite and vulnerable to known pollutants and emerging contaminants. So building resilience is critical, and understanding the gaps, but also the opportunities in our region with respect to water resources is necessary for determining effective solutions. So it is no surprise that all stakeholders must work together to ensure that water management is effective and equitable. This cannot be achieved in isolation. And that is where the Great Lakes Water Innovation and Stewardship Exchange comes in. Great Lakes WISE is a multi-stakeholder initiative created to ensure the region's water resources are used wisely and responsibly, to protect them for future generations, and to sustain the long-term economic success of the region. It is the WISE platform that spearheaded this gap analysis, thanks to the partners we have listed on the slide: Fresh Coast Climate Solutions, Primo Brands, A.O. Smith, the Water Council, Watts Water Technologies, Sloan, and Veolia. It's important to mention their support because their involvement really has helped make this report possible. And this regional gap analysis that we're discussing today will be used as a foundational resource for Great Lakes WISE to identify projects and research as we move forward. And companies wanting to be part of guiding that direction are welcome to join as a corporate member. If you are interested in Great Lakes WISE, please reach out to me or any of our partners for more information. We'd be happy to tell you more. But with the gap analysis, we hope that this regional gap analysis report will not only be a foundational resource for WISE, but also a valuable resource for each of you as well. So let's go ahead and start unpacking it. Our webinar speakers both come from Fresh Coast Climate Solutions, a Michigan headquartered consultancy with a mission to reverse climate change through solutions and transformative action. They will provide insight on where the region is positioned and share findings from the gap analysis. Ray Mindock is the Director of Water Programs at Fresh Coast Climate Solutions. She has a wealth of expertise in water stewardship, risk mitigation, and stakeholder engagement, and is adept crafting and executing tailored environmental programs for manufacturing clients. Matthew Paper is a senior technical analyst at Fresh Coast, focusing on biodiversity and water-related solutions. His background has involved extensive ecological surveying, statistical data analysis, and developing action plans to effectively manage highly impacted ecosystems. So after hearing from both of them, we should have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. We will try to wrap up at the hour. But if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can. And with that, I am pleased to hand it over to Ray and Matt. And Ray, I think you are up first, right?
And it'll work best if I unmute myself. So thanks. Thanks, Laura. Yes, Fresh Coast was very happy to work with the Council for the Great Lakes Region and WISE in supporting the development of the regional gap analysis. We felt this was, critically important in trying to understand what the gaps were, and also to identify opportunities that the corporate water stewardship partners can identify and work with. Next slide, Matt. There we go. Okay, Laura did give a little outline of what the Great Lakes region is. And what we want to really stress is within this gap analysis, there's a lot of different aspects that we looked at. And we're going to be presenting parts of that information in capsules within this webinar, but we really do encourage everyone to download the report and read the report. For the gap analysis, what we critically looked at was really what the current water landscape was. Where are we at this time? We looked at water quality within the Great Lakes region, including the Great Lakes states, Ontario and Quebec. We identified regional water vulnerabilities that can be addressed. Also summarized key policies and looked at different agreements between the states within the US and Canada. And I think something that most people are really interested. We looked at some corporate water stewardship and provide examples of stewardship and best practices. And then we also had determined data gaps and tools. So what I'd like to do is hand this over to Matt, who did an incredible job pulling this information together. So Matt, with that, on to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it was quite a wonderful opportunity to work on these systems. I'm actually based out of Michigan and Ann Arbor, surrounded by the Great Lakes, so something quite great to work on. So as Laura mentioned, the idea behind the gap analysis was trying to understand just where we're currently sitting, and then identify those gaps and opportunities, but use it as a springboard. So this is something where we'll now be able to see where we are and then start really diving deeper into some of the issues. So as Ray said, it's a hefty document, but I think it helps to just kind of put us into our place a little bit where we are. So I just wanted to start off talking about more from a quantity perspective, and then we'll go through quality into the vulnerabilities, and then Ray will take us off with the corporate water stewardship. And I wanted to just kind of lay off now that there are the way that we looked at it, as Ray said, was from a economic regional perspective, so that's states and provinces, as well as a basin perspective. And there has to be distinction between the two, because accessibility of data for your states is very different from that of the basins. And something that we notice when trying to find extraction data for regional economic regions is they're either certain states do a fantastic job of finding that information. Some states are a little bit behind. Some states, the data is out of date. and or when it is a comprehensive, it's very much out of date. And so, just as an example, this is a map from the report provided by the USGS. It's meant to be a five-yearly report that's generated. This is the most up-to-date report that can be found for the total withdrawals by the US. We weren't able to find anything from Canada, but we had more information on that. And you can see that Michigan and New York had the largest extractions. But I want to point out this is from 2015. The USGS is developing its newest platform for modeling outboard extraction, but it's specifically by certain sectors, and it should be operational in 2025. If not, some sectors are already operational, but this is in total. We haven't seen a new updated USGS report in many years, and this kind of starts to talk towards some of the issues and the gaps that we're seeing, and this kind of prefaces a lot of what we're seeing. But then when it comes to looking at the Great Lakes from a basin perspective, that data is a lot easier to access. And the reason why I make that comparison is that there is a framework that's built into the Great Lakes region, the compact agreements that provide us with frameworks to allow for that kind of reporting, that then the structure works to an extent. And so it can be potentially taken on by states in the region to try and generate that. Now, I know that there's policy and state issues that differ, but there is a framework that may be useful. And so now just diving more into come from the data from the basin side of things. We're starting to see this is a trend just from 2014 to 2022. So 8 years, not long, but enough to get an idea, is that there's a slight decline in stuff we're seeing from an extraction point of view. So this is total withdrawals within the Great Lakes Basin region. Your largest extractor was Ontario and Michigan, followed by Wisconsin and I believe New York. And we're seeing kind of this spike in 2020, which has largely been attributed to improvements in reporting and accuracy in data recording, which kind of now reflects a little bit more truthfully what's happening in that system. Ontario, we'll get a little bit later about why Ontario is such a large extractor, but it is just an interesting kind of breakdown, and that spike is something just to notice. This here, I know that it looks rather similar, but this is looking at from a sector perspective over time, once again, and we're seeing, again, as we know, the trends in who is the most impactful extractor of water withdrawals, and withdrawals in this case being that is extracted and then returned back to the system, is your thermoelectric power generation, your agriculture, well, in this case, it was public water supply and industrial, and then agriculture is a little bit lower. But the reason why we talk about thermoelectric power at all in this case is that this is once through cooling. So once through cooling being extracted from natural resources, cooled, run to cool down turbines or condensers, and then ejected or discharged back into your natural system. This water is not the same that when it came in. It's at a slightly higher temperature, even if strategies are improved or implemented to improve the water quality temperature-wise. This is still impactful, and so it needs to be understood. And then of course you have your public supply being municipal supply and industrial supply. So when we start looking into it from like more of a year by year, so this is 2022, sector by jurisdiction, you start to see just kind of like, I like this image because it provides a bit more of the nuance of what's happening per state, but then also gives you an idea of areas of, I don't want to say the word concern, I would say the words of use, and where areas of efficiency or potential strategies could be implemented to improve. Efficiency is not always the answer, but it's a fantastic way to start. So for instance, here we're seeing Indiana is substantial from its industrial usage, agriculture in Michigan, and as well as its public water supply. Ontario hitting high in 3 areas: industrial, public water supply, and its thermoelectric production, and Quebec from its public supply. Now, the reason why Quebec has such a large public supply is the basin's contribution is very small in relation to the rest of the state. So it's the fact that there's significant amount of population on that region that flows then into the lake system, and that's kind of why it's other sectors are not proportionally represented. So there's always nuance in data that just needs to be understood when looking at these things. And then when you look at it from a consumption versus withdrawal, very interestingly, the difference between a consumption being water that's not returned to the system, and then withdrawal being water that is returned. But again, water is never the same when it's extracted and then returned. It's always either impaired or a lower quality, higher temperature, or whatever the case. And I'd love it if someone could show me a fantastic example of when it is better than when it was extracted. I would love to see it, but something that I haven't often seen. And something just to understand is that the difference between that consumption and that withdrawal is still, even though withdrawal has been returned, there's still an impact associated with it. You can see once again Ontario having quite a significant impact on withdrawal. Then when it comes from a quality perspective, quality data is a lot easier to source, a lot easier to find from an entire regional perspective, because of the significant amount of regulations and permitting that's required for quality, for instance, from both from a private sector like industrial, but also from a state side. So states having to produce their impairment lists as well as reporting on it. Again, some states are better than others. Not meaning to name call, but Pennsylvania does a great job. Ohio, a little bit different on its ability to provide a stream or a wide variety of data. But they all meet the requirement, which is a really great start to water management and improving water management, is understanding where we are. From the extraction point of view, we don't really know where we are at a current status, and that's a fundamental issue. So from a quality perspective, there's a lot of information to gather, and that kind of goes into detail there. But a nice way to look at it is looking at the AOCs, like those areas of concern. 1987, I believe, was when they were formulated. 43, 9 of those have actually been delisted as of 2023, and 10 have completed their action plans. Now, an action management plan being the prescribed plans for restoration. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are restored. They're still undergoing revision to see if they've managed to get to that status. But this just kind of shows that there is on track. We are making those mitigation efforts from a quality perspective. What I do want to preface, though, is that this is 40 years in the making. And these sites, with some of the vulnerabilities that the Great Lakes is now starting to experience to a greater extent, you're going to have more and more of these kind of issue sites coming up. And that's something that just needs to be understood, that these aren't stagnant, or this isn't stable state. This is constantly fluctuating and changing. And this is actually a really great source from the State of the Great Lakes report, which is a really comprehensive look at water quality in the Great Lakes, variety of health indicators that come from that. And we just wanted to take that and look at that in a little bit more detail, and kind of identify lakes of areas of concern, but then also when we're looking at the trends and trying to understand what the nuance means when it comes to, for instance, if we go to nutrient algae, which is your fourth from the bottom, the current status is considered fair, which is great, but then the status is unchanging. But when you take that into consideration of all the voluntary programs, funding, regulations that have gone into regions around Lake Erie to try and mitigate nutrient inflow, we start to understand that potentially the programs and systems that we have in place currently now are not as effective as we're hoping they are, which means that we are needing more to get from a unchanging status to a changing positively status. And that's just kind of like when we start looking at these data sets and the status, it's not just as clean cut. We have to understand a little bit deeper what's going on, and something we kind of go into a little bit more detail in the report. And of course, just highlighting, I think one of the areas of concern, one of the partners really wants to bring up was looking at the current mutual concern. So these are chemicals of mutual concern, those that we really feel are historic and also current in terms of just what we know and the impact. All of them anthropogenic driven by major industry or then some and surrounding, and all of which have these kind of bioaccumulative impacts on human health and natural ecosystems and are persistent. That's, I think, the main thing. But when you looked, I know I flicked, I don't want to confuse folks too much, but when you looked at the previous image, drinking water was considered good quality and unchanging, which is fantastic. So we have some of the cleanest water out. But when you start looking at the nuance of where point source extraction is occurring, and you start taking into account consistent chemical inputs, poor declining water quality, algal bloom, and water treatment facilities, and how that that interaction, we started realizing that these things are still at risk. There's still risk in these systems, even if currently the status is considered good. And we have to take a lot of this nuance into account when identifying potential next steps for our research. And this kind of leads itself really nicely into some of the vulnerabilities that we looked at. Now, this isn't a comprehensive or exhaustive vulnerabilities. These are just like key point vulnerabilities that really kind of stand out. But I do feel that this is a fantastic opportunity, an area that a lot more research can go into to kind of dive into for the Great Lakes specifically. And I think one of the Laura mentioned was the growth in population is expected to increase in the Great Lakes. Again, it's state by state. Michigan is expected to have a slower but consistent growth over time till 2040. And these patterns are kind of reflected largely across the Great Lakes because of a climate security in growing industry, and it tends to be a little bit cheaper on this side than the West. But one thing that we can see when we're looking at water extraction data is that over time there's been a pattern of decline. And so if I'm going to talk to the industrial sector, or self-supply industrial sector, that's largely come from efficiencies, because efficiency in your system reduces risk. If you are able to improve operational efficiency, you're able to improve or at least create resiliency for your operation. So you can then reduce the risk that happens from potential cutoffs or breaks in infrastructure, whatever the case may be, from an external source. When it comes to public water supply, we can see that decline, but we're talking about vulnerabilities. We know, for instance, that infrastructure in the Great Lakes region is aging, outdated, and has come under some scrutiny. And with increasing population densities, we're going to start noticing greater taxation on the storm, on the local infrastructure, both from a discharge as well as supply. You're going to have you're going to have breaks in water supply to the public sector, and this is going to have ramifications on both from a human health and economic sector. And then when we're looking at the industrial sector again, we're having this growth in new economies coming in, or new industries, beg your pardon, coming in. So one of the examples that often highlighted in this one is your data centers. Data centers are requiring so much water and electricity power generation for just daily use. I mean, the numbers are staggering in what kind of water volume they require for cooling, and it's expected the Great Lakes is going to be a hub for that. We're already starting to see them popping up. And that means that we're going to start seeing high extraction. So if we are able to initiate better management strategies right at the get-go, right now, that can then go a long way in the future for how we manage this resource that is going to be under more pressure with a growing economy, which we want, but in terms of economy, not the pressure, but that's something that we have the ability to mitigate. And then moving on to some of the other vulnerabilities, we're starting to notice newer contaminants coming through, those that are across the board. When I say across the board, it represents every industry that we're seeing, everything from synthetic sweeteners to pesticides to microplastics and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, those being from your oil and gas industries. These newer contaminants, we don't quite know the impact that's happening, but they're occurring in higher and higher quantities and concentrations. Those occurring around certain areas. For instance, you're always going to find pesticides around agricultural centers, and you're going to start finding microplastic and PFAS around industrial and commercial zones. So these are just more occurring, and they're going to start getting worse, and we all know that. When it comes to, for instance, one of the questions we were fortunate enough someone put through, like, what are the hardest contaminants to remove? It depends on if you're talking about from water or from sediment, but when you're looking at water systems like your pharmaceutical hormones, incredibly difficult to manage and remove. When you're looking at microplastics aren't necessarily the issue because it's the physical carrier, but your endocrine disrupting leachates that come from those microplastics, that's where some of the issue arises. And that's why the control is important. And then of course, PFAS being your kind of, we're still on the learning curve on what that means for not just for long-term, but also for management of that. And so there's a lot coming in, and we just need to try and get on top of it. And then of course, climate change. Now I understand in the case of the Great Lakes, climate change is its own beast, but we are looking at it from a exacerbator. So in this case, climate change is an exacerbator of all the issues that we're currently seeing. It's kind of where the teeth are coming in when it comes to these issues. It is increasing the rate at which these issues are occurring, as well as the level of impact that they have over and above the threshold that that kind of a lot of resiliency systems that we have currently just can't sustain. So for instance, and they all knock on, you know, so when you have your increases in surface temperature, reduction in ice, you're going to start getting warmer temperatures, algal blooms, you're going to start getting declining in fishing populations, so fisheries will decline. You start getting your increases in storm frequency and intensity, resulting in taxation on your stormwater infrastructure, increases in soil erosion and water contamination. And then again, driven in, you're going to start seeing kind of like increases in algal blooms and declines in water quality, which have impacts on human health. I mean, water treatment, a lot of these factors, which a lot of utilities just aren't prepared or haven't, if I don't want to say unprepared, I want to say the words, are in the process of hopefully getting ready for. These things are coming and they are impacting, and this is one of the severe vulnerabilities that we're seeing. And I would say it's a difficult one to try and adjust. But the wonderful thing is that the industries and corporates do have a role, and they have a powerful role in this, from how to initiate and how to drive corporate water stewardship, and how that can then have offlows throughout your network. And then Ray will take us through that. You're muted still.
Okay, is it okay? Perfect. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to discuss corporate water stewardship a bit. That's something that we spent a lot of time on. I want to upfront thank our other founding members because their contributions, the discussions we had with them, really helped build our stewardship unit out. For some of you, well, I'm hoping most of you understand what water stewardship is, but for those of you who don't, I'm going to just provide a pretty typical definition of what it is. So water stewardship is using water in a manner that's environmentally stable and sustainable, socially equitable, and economically beneficial. The water stewardship is associated with both the site and your watershed or your catchment, and stewardship is developed using a stakeholder inclusive process. So there are a lot of different aspects of stewardship that should be considered when corporations are moving forward in this area. Again, I do want to just thank the founding members because they really helped in the practices that they are using right now, and also in providing us with some examples of best practices. So when we talked about the stewardship, we looked at a couple of things. We looked at circular economy, basically, you know, what's the status of people looking at the economy of water reuse, that type of thing, and they've been, and that's something that's readily accepted and being practiced on the manufacturing and site level. Water efficiency and reuse, again, that's something more of a site level process that happens, and that is being carried out by some. We also took a little stab at seeing what some of the new emerging initiatives are, and I think you have to go to you'll have to read the report to learn more about that. Education and awareness. Anyone who's is practicing stewardship understands the importance of education and awareness. You can't have stewardship practices. You can't, it's very difficult to engage your other water stewards, other stakeholders, if they don't understand, if they're not aware and understand what stewardship and why you're trying to make these changes. Regulatory and economic incentives, they're out there. And the one thing that we really do want to talk a bit about is best practices. Okay, thanks, Matt. So when we looked at best practices, we grouped them into 3 different areas. We looked at corporate actions, site actions, and engagement actions. Again, stewardship depends on stakeholder engagement, so it's important to pull that out. What I'd like to do is kind of provide an example of each of these different actions and how we've seen it used, either by members, our founding members, or other clients that we have worked with, and where we kind of sit with that. So for corporate actions, one thing when we're dealing with stewardship, it is a top-down decision. So your executive committee has to be involved. They have to have a good understanding, and typically when you're developing a stewardship program, you develop strategies which need to be developed and signed off at an executive level. Water quality targets, and I would also add quantity targets. We see water quantity targets much more than water quality targets. Not that the water quality targets aren't there. In the US, when we're looking at quality targets, most of those are prescribed by permitting and such. Water quantity are actions that can be addressed across the corporation. Again, you need the corporate's decision to do the investment, spend the money, allocate the money for R&D, and then looking at new ideas. For the corporate actions, the one thing that we've seen the most is really kind of water quantity targets. And in some cases, we've seen clients who've demonstrated their stewardship practices by establishing across the board on a monthly basis, they track at every facility on a global basis, the amount of water that they've used, the amount of water that's recycled, and then the amount of water that's discharged. And they have their corporate goals, 2030, 2040 goals that they have to meet. One of the other softer goals that they're using is a water intensity. And that is something that is very useful. That's looking at a footprint. How much water are you using to produce your product? So water quantity goals are they're a good place to start at a corporate level, to track across a corporation, and they're in many cases readily attainable. For site actions, again, that's just within the boundaries of your facility. You're looking at making sure you have a baseline water use. In many facilities, it's surprising. You walk into them and there's water running, there's water on the floors, because water generally is not, the value of water is not always appreciated to the level it should be. Facilities that just have a turn it off policy or turn it off program, that is very helpful, and it begins to help your employees, who are stakeholders, understanding the importance of water if those type of initiatives are in place. Metering and monitoring, another one that's critically important. And monitoring, when you're metering, there are different levels of metering. Part of the stewardship process is continual improvements. So you don't have to have every process, every line metered. You can start with an overall like level 1 metering system, just trying to understand where most of the water is used. Based on that, you can define additional metering programs, level 2, looking at processes that may be critical to you that you really want to understand. So it doesn't have to be a one and done type situation. You really want to be able to look at that and and track water where you need to track the water within your processes and within your facilities. Engineering and maintenance teams, in many cases, but well, clearly they're engineers and they have the answers. And if they have the direction from a corporate level executive that that changes within water stewardship are important to them, they're going to find the solutions. And I've seen easy solutions. One facility we went to just had a tagging system that if they saw water on the floor someplace, something just didn't look right, anyone could place a tag there. And then the maintenance and engineering staff would look at each of those situations, determine, was it a real situation? Maybe it was, something that just happened once, but evaluate that situation and then put it in a process of making changes. And just within that process, this facility saw much better water use and water savings. And again, it took it down to the level of the employees who were taking ownership in the stewardship process. There's also more digital technologies that are being available. Those should be used to the maximum extent that you can. For site actions, if I had to kind of select one that I saw as most important, it's metering and monitoring. If you're not tracking, if you don't understand where your water is being used in your process, it's going to be very difficult to be having stewardship actions that are meaningful. So that on a site level, that's where I would like to point people to. For engagement actions, again, we walk into many sites, we start talking stewardship, and we talk about stakeholders, we talk about engagement, and the walls go up. Because a lot of times within a corporation, they don't necessarily, they want to be careful how the communication process with the stakeholders. Stakeholders, you have to remember, stakeholders are your employees. Your employees can be your best stakeholders and the ones that actually are taking the information out to the community. So never underestimate the power of your employees. Some of the engagement actions that can be considered are high-level engagement actions, just working with public-private partnerships, working with NGOs in the area. That's important. And it's also, it's not a difficult task to take on. It's something that the NGOs are already working on some of these issues, and just having the engagement in supporting these actions can be very meaningful towards the solution, and also the people who are helping to make these actions in place. Again, I mentioned stakeholder interactions. Don't be afraid of your stakeholders. There can be difficult conversations, but they also can be and should be part of the solution that you're coming to when you're dealing with watershed issues. Supply chain and value chain, those are both should be key considerations when you're looking at engagement actions, because in many cases we find that the most significant water risk is not within your walls, it's within your supply chain and within your value chain. So you need to make sure that that's where you're looking. And then engagement of local community, that's key. Find out if you just have, there may be a local river cleanup or, that type of thing that's already in place. A local community event where you can go out and have a booth and talk about your water stewardship actions and help educate individuals and your community on different stewardship aspects. Okay, let's go to the next one, Matt. Oh, great. I can turn this one over to Matt because he was the one who spent the most time digging through the data.
Thanks, Rex. Yeah, so one of the key points of this was just trying to understand what would be some of the potential data gaps that we're seeing. And or not just data gaps, but just from a application also, like how do we implement and where the gaps are there. So I think one thing I got across pretty quickly was the water monitoring. Water monitoring, Red emphasizes on a private scale, the significant gaps that occur within the US. Canada has done a far better job when it comes to mapping from a water quality perspective. There are nuanced pieces there that still need to be addressed, but from the US, a lot of data sets are either outdated or the stations haven't been tracked recently. And where they are tracked, they are fantastic. The impairment lists that come with some of the data sets are really great, but again, it's state by state. Some states just find it very difficult to try and get to those systems and keep that monitoring up. One of the key aspects we found was the irregularities in the data. So having differentiations in the units collected or timing or what is collected and what isn't collected, that inconsistency even between states, not even between countries, plays a really big role in trying to how do we manage these systems if we can't effectively align our units to a single or our variables to a single point. So that's where we started noticing quite a lot of difficulty when it comes to trying figuring out where we're standing. And then when it comes to limited stream flow and groundwater, this kind of talks to the first point again, groundwater especially. So the study does take into account groundwater when it comes for some of the extraction information, but on a general sense, groundwater is a very difficult topic. And I know that there's a lot of improvements that have been happening recently within groundwater monitoring, and it's been fantastic to be able to see monitoring wells pop up and be able to access that data, but it's that transparency when trying to get across systems. So for instance, in the state of is it Minnesota? Let me not bring that up. But if I don't know exactly what I'm talking about, but there are some some states that have done a fantastic job and some that don't, and this just comes down to priority and getting the teams out and then doing that kind of work and finding the funding for it. That's predominantly where we're finding that. And then coordination. Coordination has been such a big factor. Private sector does a fantastic job of measuring certain variables, and then state does a great job there too. So I believe it's the AWWA, the Alliance for Wastewater Association, they do a fantastic industrial survey for the private sector, which goes out and a lot of data can be collected from that. And just having that and talking to state and kind of bodies and getting that private and public sector information together so that it can be utilized across from like a state perspective is really quite beneficial. I think one of the things that we're also finding for this is the transparency. Some transparency when it comes to identifying data sources. Trying to source data sources is quite a hard one, and then accessing specific information that you're requiring has proven to be a bit tricky. But we're finding, I mean, access to information is so much broader than it's ever been, but we can always do with more data. I think that's one thing that most folks can agree with. And then I think one of the major things that isn't necessarily utilized to the fullest extent, especially in the US, Canada has done a far greater job at this, is the inclusion and the use of local communities, indigenous populations to assist with monitoring, assist with nuanced information for those systems and actually utilize that information. That's something that has been pretty stark between the two. And this is not us versus them. This is just a Great Lakes region. How do we align best practice and how do we bring that together? And then, of course, just climate change modeling. Now, the reason why I bring up climate change modeling as a gap is that the systems like GLOS and NHN and the biomonitoring network there's so much data that's available, but the nuances in the Great Lakes make modeling quite difficult. And when our baseline information is missing and gaps of baseline data, it becomes harder for us to start modeling out climate impacts in those regions. And so this is where there's kind of like these cascading impacts of getting that baseline sorted, is that's when we start kind of really seeing improvement. And yeah, so I'll hand it back to Rach.
Thanks, Matt. So one of the things we do want to really follow up with and kind of end the conversation with some of the key takeaways and the directions where we think that we can move forward. Again, the whole purpose of this gap analysis was start to understand the landscape. That's where we're at. What we are looking at, what we want to do next is use this information, build out projects that we can work on together. So we need, both of understanding the data, identifying projects, and then working together. And if you're interested in this, as Laura had said, reach out to us. We are looking for trying to expand the group of people that are really working on these solutions together. Some of the key takeaways that we've found are, as Matt had talked about, the data gaps is really critical, and we need to start having people work together, share data, looking at what monitoring's out there and what additional gaps should be filled with the monitoring programs. This really needs to be addressed. You can't solve problems if you don't understand the data to determine the solutions. Water management, that's also an issue that really needs to be improved with having effective and really equitable policies that need to be established. We've seen examples of when policies aren't equitable, especially we're looking at a very large region of the Great Lakes. We need to be working together to preserve our water. Infrastructure is, when people ask me, what do you think is a key issue to deal with when you're talking about stewardship? Infrastructure is typically the answer they get. I think we're all aware of infrastructure, the age of the infrastructure, whether it be water lines, wastewater treatment, stormwater management, a lot of changes happening there. And then from the Great Lakes perspective, we also need to look at shoreline protection. A lot of the solutions that 10 or 20 years ago we thought were solutions, we realized really should not be in place to make progress. Dams are coming out, canals are coming out. The hard walls, hard solutions are moving forward to more soft solutions. One of the other areas that we've looked at in looking at where we could go is we've seen, Matt's gone over the list of contaminants. One of the questions that we received up front was, which are the hardest contaminants to deal with? And my answer is the one that we don't know yet. We need to start coordinating these efforts and really looking within the region to try to find these solutions, because they're not easy solutions. And that coordinated response will go a long ways. And the best way that we can get to move some of these stewardship practices forward is participation. We need businesses, we need manufacturing, not only to adopt stewardship practices, but make best practice their practice, just the practice that they use every day, especially when it comes to water-related activities. They know how to reduce their footprint. Let's just start working together to help them understand the importance of water stewardship, and have the businesses can be the ones leading the charge. Matt, do you have anything that we missed there?
No, I think just yeah, I think you nailed it. Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, Laura, do you have some questions for us?
I sure do. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ray and Matt. That was fantastic. Matt, yeah, great. So we've got several questions. I know we only have under 10 minutes left, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. But I also want to let our audience know that if we're not able to get to your question, Ray and Matt have generously offered to support with answering those after the webinar. So we will try to get back to you with those questions so we're not able to answer. I want to start with one that came in with the registration. And it's asking about water, how better water management equates to better risk management, supply chain, ESG, and market benefits. Do you one of you want to touch on that?
I will run with that one. And I want to just change it around a little bit. The water management starts with risk management, and not necessarily the management, the understanding of where your risk is. There are a lot of publicly available tools to evaluate risk, not just risk at your facility, but risk within your supply chain. So looking at things like scarcity, where are you getting most of your manufacturing? Where is it being done? Is it being shipped to your facility? Looking at risk and understanding the priority locations will allow you to develop management plans to really address the key factors.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. We also have a question, one that came in previously, and it looks like it's touching on one that just came in also. So I'm going to kind of jump to this one around innovative technologies or approaches like AI. And Mary had written in maybe in a little bit more detail than the previous question, but on topic of better management strategies, how are we using AI or planet.com satellite observations to detect problems before they become crises? And then a second question to that is, what real-time observations do we have, like the Emerald Isle Ferry water quality data live report on pH, oxygen, chlorophyll, et cetera?
That's a fantastic question. So I don't quite know what the question is. Are you wanting a bit more of an expansion on what the current rules are, or are you wanting? I mean, you've listed some fantastic data sets and great resources already. I know what Ray mentioned now is from a global coarse granular, like a granular look. I think I'm going to say coarse look. The tools are online. There's several. I mean, it depends on what you're after. But when you start looking at WRI, WWF for your risk management, and well, at least operational risk, kind of from like a very broad supply chain perspective, and then you can start finally kind of getting finer and finer and finer when it starts getting to your site. This is very much an industrial perspective. I understand that. I don't quite know which side you're wanting to talk from, if it's from NGO or if it's from, they'll have different requirements. But we're finding, especially with AI, the use of like, for instance, I work a lot with MODIS and CONUS data for some of the biodiversity metrics that we do. And water quality comes up quite a lot, but we're looking at from like a factor input point of view, not necessarily from a mapping, because it's a bit difficult with that one. But when you start looking at AI and its ability to understand, or at least assist with modeling out issues, we're finding it leaps and bounds on what we're able to do before. When you start looking at from like a site-specific thing, I know there's been some great examples of applying AI into engineering management systems. So when applying, when looking for efficiencies in terms of not just in like your operations, but in kind of discharge points too, when looking at efficiencies, the nuanced information that can be picked up by appropriate establishment of AI has been really amazing. And I mean, there's also the interpersonal relationship in terms of, like, for instance, allowing staff members, this was an example I heard at a recent conference where staff members were able to interact with an AI interface that allowed them to access detailed information about systems and problems that they're facing, and be able to solve that problem immediately on the stand right there, without having to waste the time and trying to digest and figure out what the problem is, that information was right on hand. So in that regard, the AI systems are phenomenal, but I can hear that that's not quite well. I don't think I'm quite answering what you're after there, but if not, I would love to hear more about it. Maybe just pop me an email and we can have a really good chat about that. That sounds, yeah, please.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and again, thanks for your willingness to take the conversation, continue the conversation after the webinar. So I want to get to another question, and Ray touched on this a little bit when she was talking about sort of like moving forward, but a question around leveraging green infrastructure, and it's what opportunities exist for leveraging green infrastructure or nature-based solutions to address water management gaps.
I'm going to let Matt handle that with just a preface. One of the things that we've done at Fresh Coast is we understand the interconnection between water and nature. So the reason Matt and I work together so closely is because we're moving that forward. We understand you can't solve a water problem without addressing something in nature, and the best ways to solve problems within nature are going to be dealing with water. So Matt, with that, Matt is our expert on water-based and nature-based solutions. So
such a horrible word, but yeah, I would say from a nature-based solutions, I think the solutions part is something to focus on, is that you kind of have to know your problem first. If you can understand your problem that you're facing, then you can start adapting and leveraging the solution. So you have to first, a nature-based solution isn't something that can just be placed into a system. It kind of, you have to understand the system first before those things can be established. So for instance, if you are experiencing flooding in a region or an area, in some cases, wetland restoration is your best bet because wetland systems were apparent in that area. The hydrology for that region supports that kind of system. But in other cases, that just isn't going to work because historically that landscape never had that infrastructure. But yeah, it comes down to when leveraging your natural nature-based solutions, it's understanding your system and then understanding historically what that system was able to sustain. And then I would something that we've noticed a lot is that I applaud people when they are wanting to fix the problem. I think that's phenomenal. But also if like, I'm not a landscape architect, I can very comfortably say that I know of many, and they will be able to speak about the implementation of nature-based solutions far more accurately than I can. But bring in that expertise into play, because it only benefits you. A nature-based solution is only as good as it's implemented. So just bear that in mind, and be ambitious. I would say be ambitious with your strategies, because in the future these things are going to start becoming key. You can look at it from any type of perspective. If you want to look at it from like a carbon sequestration perspective, they can become key points of offset. Or if you want to look at it from a reporting perspective, especially from an industrial sector, these are potential key reporting metrics that can be used in the future, and then also mitigating risk from an operational perspective. So it's a really solid win-win, but just bringing the expertise to nail those down.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Matt. And we are running out of time. So we will take a look at all the questions that came in and try to get back to them. I did notice one that I want to touch on quickly, because Patricia asked about if there are any existing efforts to facilitate collective action on corporate water stewardship. That's exactly what the Great Lakes Water Innovation and Stewardship Exchange is doing. So I will be sure to send you more information on that, Patricia. But so Matt and Ray, thank you so much for this presentation, all the hard work that you have put into this gap analysis. It really is an information-packed document, and I hope everybody will dive into it. We've shared the link. I also want to thank the partners of Great Lakes Wise, the Water Council, A.O. Smith, Sloan, Primo Brands, Veolia, Watts Water Technologies, and Fresh Coast Climate Solutions. thank you to all of them for their leadership and commitment to water stewardship in the Great Lakes. And of course, any companies or other stakeholders wanting to get involved in Great Lakes Wise, please reach out to me or any of our partners. We'd be happy to share more information and get you involved. A recording of this webinar will be available early next week. I know we've had some questions about it. The slides will also be shared at that time. So keep an eye out in your inbox for that. We'll also include a link to the report in it as well. And just quickly, our next webinar is just a few weeks away on March 6th, and it's a perfect follow-up to this webinar. We will be speaking with A.O. Smith on their commitment to efficient water practices and how they are managing water use in their operations. So that should be quite interesting, tie in nicely. I hope everybody will be able to join us then. But for now, thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.